Hi. If touch is the final frontier in human sense research, why wouldn't we pair it with space, the final frontier of human exploration? Yes, nerds out there, I know we can explore the ocean a lot more and we don't know that much about it, but at some point, we're gonna have explored the whole ocean. It's finite. Space, not the case for that. Rhyme. Nailed it. Now, we know how important touch is. We know what happens if we're in space. We know the emotional systems of touch, and we know what happens when people are isolated and how that can really affect our emotions, not just personally, but also professionally. We can think about it from a scientific perspective. So today, we're going to touch on the lack of touch, the absence of it, and how it can happen to anyone. But first, you're flying around the ISS. You've been there a year. Every touch that you have had has been specific. There's no breeze on your face. You can't sit outside. You just feel things that you have to feel. There's no pressure on your feet when you walk. There's no gravity. Well, microgravity, but you're basically falling all the time. Every touch that you make in space is a decision. It's a moment. And that was the life for Scott Kelly, NASA astronaut commander of the International Space Station. This is the man who spent almost an entire year in space, 340 days. In interviews, Scott mentions the struggles that he has of spending so long in space. And in his final video from the International Space Station, he said, I think the hardest part
is being isolated, in a physical sense from people on the ground that are important to you. But there's certainly, a loss of connection with folks on the ground that you care for and love and, want to spend time with. That I think.
So I thought, who better to talk about touch deprivation?
My name is Scott Kelly. I'm a retired U.S. Navy captain and also a former NASA astronaut.
Excellent. How long have you been in space, kind of cumulatively?
Total number of days is 520.
While you were in space, did they prepare you psychologically and physically?
Leading up to a space flight, you get, you have training sessions on how to deal with stress and, coping mechanisms, how you deal with conflict, whether it's with your crewmates or people on the ground or, your family. Our families get some support, not as well as the crew members do, but they do get some emotional and psychological support from NASA while we're in space. After the mission, not as much. Sometimes you feel like that's yesterday's news and people have to move on to the person in space, which is the most important thing. I think, though, when we come out of this situation with this pandemic, people will, feel like they have a lot of support during it. But when it's over and things are getting back to normal, people will still need support because I would imagine this situation, this environment is going to create a lot of people coming out of this with some, PTSD type issues. So we're going to have to continue to look and track that, unfortunately, but it's absolutely necessary.
Did you feel lonely when you were on station, especially with looking down at the world and knowing it's filled with people and here you are kind of apart from it? Did you feel lonely or anything?
You mean like it's lonely out in space lonely?
Yeah, kind of.
No, not really. For me, I was part of something that was much larger than myself and something I was dedicated to doing. I was there with people that, I enjoyed being around and respected, doing work that has important and serious consequences if you don't give it the appropriate amount of attention. So, I wouldn't say I was ever lonely, but I certainly missed people that were not with me greatly. I missed them. I missed Earth. I missed all the great things that Earth has to offer, which is just about everything. There was loneliness involved, but it wasn't by me. I think my family was more lonely as a result.
Yeah, it's like that old saying, it's easier to leave than to be left.
Yeah, you're the one doing the extraordinary experience and doing the thing where their life is just continuing like normal without you there. So it's a lot easier for that person that's left behind to miss the other person. Because I was just so occupied doing something extraordinary that kind of clouds your, I think, emotions a little bit.
Astronauts have to deal with this physical isolation all the time. The ISS, it's as big as a 6-bedroom house, but you can't leave, you can't go outside. It's not unlike what we're all doing during coronavirus right now, is it? I mean, a little bit. We're not flying through space and orbiting the Earth every couple hours, but whatever. When you're in space, do you feel stress like that, like now, kind of? Like, feel like you're isolated and that increases your stress level?
Absolutely. I mean, you're isolated. You can't go home. You have very little freedom of choice. You can't go outside physically. If you wanted to quit your job, you're not allowed to. It's not like you can just say, I'm done and I'm out of here. The space station isn't really that small, but after a long time, even though it's pretty big, after months, you can feel like the walls are closing in on you a little bit. It can be anxiety producing, fatigue producing, especially in the last third of a mission. It's what NASA, our European and other international partners, particularly the Russians, recognize that towards the end of something, the stress level really starts to build. But there are things you can do to prevent that. We don't have to live with it. We can. There are ways to get around that. Because 6 months was a really long time to be in space, and I knew that, and I was ready to come home. I found when I flew in space for a year, I kind of went into the year-long mission more with a plan, how I would get through that, and hopefully have as much energy and enthusiasm for what I was doing in the end that I had in the beginning.
So what was your plan? How did you kind of conceptualize being isolated for so long?
Part of it was having the right perspective. My mission was to be on the space station for nearly a year. So I felt like if I wanted to be a good astronaut, do a good job, I needed to complete in a very positive way one of the parts of my mission, and that was just being in space for a long time. Having that level of motivation, I think is important. And I think, it's similar here. What we're doing here, responding to this pandemic, is a collective mission that the whole world is a part of. Do you want to be the good astronaut in this situation, or do you want to be the bad astronaut? And I would say most people want to do a good job. Think of this as your job where performance matters, not only to you and your family, but it matters to everybody. How we follow the guidance, how we don't infect other people, how we avoid getting infected ourselves, so we can, as quickly as possible, get back to normal. And it's going to take a sustained effort. It's going to take a long time, but we need to maintain focus. Yeah, part of it is understanding what your mission is. And then there's other things. Having a schedule that has variety, from work to taking care of your environment, to hobbies, to connecting with people, family, your friends. In this case of the space station, Earthlings. Going to sleep and waking up at regular times is very important. Having time devoted to yourself, time devoted to be alone. Maybe you're in a situation where you have a lot of people in one household, and scheduling maybe time in a bedroom by yourself where you can just have some peace and quiet is important. Very similar during the week, different on the weekends. I think the weekend, I kind of treat our apartment almost like the space station, where the front door is the airlock, and we try to keep the bad stuff outside, which means the virus, good stuff inside, which is us, and those two things should not cross. In other words, we have to keep this place clean. Very similar on the space station. Virus and bacteria grow more quickly in space. When you're isolated, whether it's in space or on Earth, our immune systems are suppressed from the stress, the lack of exercise, lack of natural sunlight. Very, very analogous to what the situation is in space. Also, I think it's important to understand who your crewmates are, your teammates, the people you're in isolation with. Maybe you're by yourself, which presents other challenges to be by yourself. But, in my experience at NASA, we were all different. There were things that my crewmates were better at than I could ever be, and likewise things that I was better at than them. And it's, I think, incumbent upon all of us to support each other and elevate each other's performance. But you also have to understand we are not all the same. We're not born the same way. We do not have the same innate talents and abilities. So you need to work within the crew that you have. I think it's important for people to share the common work in any environment. On the space station, there are things that we do as individuals, but taking care of the place is everyone's job. And I always would try to do a little bit more than what was my fair share of work. So if I was up there with two people or one other person, I would try to do 51% of what either that person or I thought I was supposed to do. So if you're doing a little bit more, you're probably doing just enough. So it's important to have, I think, a balance of the shared responsibilities. I think it's important to share. On the space station, when I was up there, we lost two resupply rockets. SpaceX one blew up and a Russian one crashed. And we were running low on supplies. The cosmonauts were a little bit lower than us, and we were able to share some of our food with them. And that made them feel great. Also made us feel good because we felt like we were helping them. In this situation, I think it's very important to help people when you can. And I hope you will find it's as good for the receiver as it is for the giver. What else? I've talked a lot. I never counted the days, really. And I don't think we should in this situation because we don't know how long this is going to last. Could last a long time for some people. We will probably be in some type of quarantine in and out for, the foreseeable future. So having this dream of this is going to be over in a week or 2 weeks, I don't think it's helpful. If you ask me right now how many days I've been doing this, how many weeks, I couldn't even tell you how many weeks. I don't think of that in those terms. I think of it in, what am I doing right now that is important to our situation? And then I think of a little bit about the weekend, like what am I going to watch on Netflix on Sunday? Please don't count the days. Have a schedule. Have a weekend that's different. Hobbies are so important to disconnect yourself from the reality of this. I had, people have hobbies in space. I had a hobby. So in my 20 years at NASA, what I learned is that everything we did, actually most things we did, was not rocket science. But when it was rocket science, you need to get your information from the rocket scientist, not your Facebook friend or somebody from some web news organization that you've never heard of. This is serious business we're dealing with. And probably the most serious thing we've ever had to deal with in our whole lives. Everyone. Me included. And I've flown in space 4 times. We need to get our information from the right people, trusted sources, the CDC, National Institute of Health, World Health Organization, universities that are really on top of this. Not your Uncle Joe, just because Uncle Joe has a big following on Facebook. He might be smart, but I'm pretty sure he's not an epidemiologist or a physician or a scientist. Maybe someone has an Uncle Joe that is, but most of us, our Uncle Joe is not an epidemiologist. So, get your advice from the right person.
I'm really glad that I got to talk to Scott Kelly. He is an amazing human. Astronauts are peak humans, and I love them so much.
Enjoyed talking to you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Scott, for taking the time. That is essentially what you want to do with group living. You want people to feel together. You don't want to create otherness. Those people are not us. We are us. You want to create a culture where anyone can join, anyone can learn this camp song, and once you've learned it, you're a member of the group. That's it. That is really great for group living and for surviving during times of isolation and during times of loneliness. One of my favorite television shows, and the thing that actually got me really excited about Discovery Channel in the 1990s, was this reality show called The Eco Challenge. Maybe you remember it, I don't know if you do. But essentially they would drop teams into places and they'd have to hike across Australia, and they would hike this really long distance. And the idea was they'd have to work together as a team, and they represented a lot of these things while doing it. And the one that I think people underestimated at that time was self-care and understanding yourself and your body. A lot of people would end up with injuries because they couldn't speak up or they felt like they couldn't with their teammates. There was always one team who were like Navy SEALs or Marines or something, and nothing against those groups of people and people who choose those career paths. However, those teams never won. You would think that those teams would do so well in a thing where it's like survivalism, hiking in the open, make sure you're prepared, military, absolutely. They would never win. The people that won were groups that were open and honest about how they were, what they were feeling, how they were thinking, where they were mentally and physically, and strength and emotion. It was a great show. I'd love it if we brought it back. So let's think back to touch. Touch is related to touch resolution. Remember the paperclip trick I was teaching you earlier. And that resolution will change as you get older. Think about how your eyes get fuzzier and your ears start to ring. Your sense of touch also starts to dull as years go on. Remember from way back, you've got Merkel cells or Merkel discs. The Merkel cells or discs take care of pressure and position, shapes and edges of things. It's also connected to proprioception, the understanding of where your body is in 3D space, one of my favorite words. Over time, these Merkel cells start to disappear. They dull. It turns out, like a lot of things, touch is most sensitive between the years of 16 and 18 years old. Anecdotally, if you think back to dating in high school personally, sense of touch was sometimes overwhelming with like first girlfriends when I was 16, 17, 18. And it was like, whoo! Pain and temperature receptors also dull over time. The genitalia becomes less sensitive. Pain dulling might actually be a good thing. Like as your body starts to break down, you don't want to feel all your joints being broken, but being touched is emotional. So if your touch, your sense of emotional connection, your physical connection to your family and to others starts to break down and you don't have good touch connections in place, that can be really detrimental to people who are getting older. Touch connects you to your world, connects you to place. Think of astronauts on the International Space Station.
How did it feel to be back around humans? Once you came back to the ground, was it like overwhelming? Was it a familiar, you just like a ride in a bicycle?
When I got pulled out of the capsule, it was kind of mind-blowing. I was like, where did all these people come from? There's like 100 people at the capsule. It seemed like it was like everyone on Earth was there. Because, you're usually up there with 6 people for a really long time, some of them. And then, you land, you're on the space station for a year, you land, and then a few minutes later, they open the capsule, and there's like all these people. You don't recognize hardly any of them. And it's, it's a little overwhelming. I think there's getting back from space after a long time, there's probably some PTSD involved in this for various reasons. And I think it's going to be similar when we get done with this pandemic, whenever that may be.
And usually, very famously, in fact, astronauts who come back to Earth are more connected to nature, are more precious of the home we have and of the people who they share it with. This is called the overview effect. Think of Dr. Manhattan from The Watchmen. He didn't care about humans anymore. He wasn't connected to them. They weren't important to him. He went to Mars and he built himself a base there and was like, I'm sick of these humans and their petty problems. A lack of connection is serious stuff, and it can really affect how we see the world around us. And there are humans that cannot touch, that have no sense of touch. And I've alluded to them throughout this piece, like GL from earlier. It's very rare, and in fact, it's so rare, and I think this is gonna blow your mind because it blew my mind. It's so rare, there's no word for it. Think about it. If you're blind, you can't see, right? If you're deaf, you can't hear. If you're mute, you can't talk, but that's not really a sense, right? There's hypogesia. I can't really pronounce that word, but that means can't taste. There's anosmia, which is can't smell. Yes, there is hypoesthesia, which is what Google says when you Google no sense of touch, but that's literally the reduced sense of touch. You had it, and it's hypo, as in it's below normal or under, so it's reduced. You had, not no mo. But without touch, if you're born without touch, which is very rare, they call it touch blindness. They have to use the sense of sight in order to describe what touch is without it. It's very inelegant, but there you have it, touch blindness. That's the term that is used in the research that I found. And there are different forms of this kind of touch blindness. For example, there's strange touch, which is an experiment where people were blindfolded and they were asked to negotiate a room, like walk around, and some people had trouble staying upright without their sense of sight. Isn't that weird? Because their touching wasn't working. There are also people who, when you're blindfolded and you can't see your body, you don't have your proprioception. It's a genetic problem, and you don't know where your hand is in 3D space without the sense of sight. That's a touch disorder because your cells can't tell where you are. It's fascinating. And there's still a lot to learn here. We're really just, and if you'll excuse all of these references to body parts, we're just scratching the surface of touch. People with no touch are so rare that Lyndon's example of GL from earlier is one of the only ones that I could find. GL puts her hand in her pocket and she cannot tell the difference between a penny 1.25. She cannot feel her feet on the ground. She has to wear gloves when cleaning to make sure she doesn't burn herself with the chemicals or accidentally bleach her hands and damage them. When she's cooking, she has to wear things so that she doesn't cut herself. She can't pet your kitty cat. She can't feel someone else petting your kitty cat, if you know what I'm saying. Can't feel a hug, tap on the shoulder. How are people impacted by that? If you really think about it, try imagine being in those shoes. You couldn't feel the shoes. You'd be impacted pretty heavily. Poet Sanabur Khan said, "Your hand touching mine. This is how galaxies collide." And sometimes it does feel that way. Now imagine if you couldn't do that. Devastating. This was episode 4 of 5 about the sense of touch and about physical contact and how it's important and emotional and physical. So make sure you check out all the episodes if you haven't. And if you've heard of optical illusions, next time, that's what we're talking about, but for the sense of touch, which I have dubbed touch illusions. I don't know. I couldn't find a good word for it. Think about that and consider ticking that subscribe button so you can come back and see that next time. I am Trace. Thanks for this uno dose of Trace moment, and I will see you in the future.
I got a few books. Endurance, A Year in Space, A Lifetime of Discovery. I have a book of pictures, Infinite Wonder, and a kid's book, My Journey to the Stars. Got another kid's book coming out next week. I have a young reader version of Endurance. You can find all those on Amazon or barnesandnoble.com, I'm sure. Thanks for having me.